definition of terrorism: the systematic use of terror, especially as a means of coercion. But what is terror? According to the dictionary I hold in my hand, terror is violent or destructive acts, such as bombing, committed by groups in order to intimidate a population or government into granting their demands. So what's a terrorist? They're calling me a terrorist, like they don't know who the terror is. When they put it on me, I tell them this.
So that song was Terrorist by Loki, and it's a great song. I recommend you check it out. So, hello and welcome to Captive Minds. I am Shaenah Batterson, and I am a writer, otherwise known as the Red Snail. With me is Max Perry, an independent journalist. Hi, Max.
Hey, Shaenah, it's good to be back for another episode. Looking forward to it.
Due to the ongoing genocide in West Asia, along with Donald Trump's deportment of Hamas sympathizing protesters, we're going to discuss terrorism, although not in the way one might think. The term terrorist has been weaponized by the US empire to dismiss resistance movements abroad, as well as dissidents at home, especially with the label of domestic terrorist. Yet, if we examine the history, we'll see that terrorism has been supported by the Western Empire for almost a century. It has been used to justify states of emergency, fight the communist threat, and bring about US-friendly regime change. Let's start with post-World War II Europe and Operation Gladio. Max, do you want to explain that a little bit?
Yeah, that's actually a great place to start because it's really one of the best examples, I think, of the West's support for actual terrorism and specifically like right-wing fascist terrorism. And it's also, the victims of that terrorism were largely, European citizenry, Western civilians. Um, and I mean, before I even get into Gladio, because it was a joint NATO CIA covert operation that was conducted starting at the beginning of the Cold War in the early 50s. Um, and it was, before I even get into that, it's sort of, NATO itself, we kind of have to remind people, was formed, first of all, really to destroy the Soviet Union. But the reason that Operation Gladio employed or incorporated right-wing terrorist groups was because there was, I think, this specter of fascism looming over NATO itself, because not only did it, immediately after the war was over, not only did the West, rearm Germany, but a lot of the generals and military figures that were brought into NATO, from the Supreme Allied Command all the way up to the Supreme Allied Commander level, from Hans Speidel to Adolf Heisinger, if I'm saying their names correctly. Um, and of course, in Germany itself, in West Germany, um, their intelligence agency, and this is one of my favorite words to say, is the Bundesnachrichtendienst. Probably butchering it, but the BND in Germany was founded by Reinhard Gehlen, their intelligence agency, who was one of Hitler's super spies, as he called them. So there's always a specter of fascism looming over NATO, and the whole idea of the EU or NATO was really kind of like a realization of what the Nazis had tried to, or their vision for a big, large, single political entity with their expansionism. But on that basis, um, basically they, on the premise that the Soviets were going to eventually invade Europe, they, the MI6 and the CIA and NATO, they got together with all the various European intelligence agencies in Italy and Belgium and elsewhere. They got together to initiate a covert operation to prevent or counter what they hypothesized as a Soviet invasion, and then on the premise of after that invasion, a Soviet occupation. And so they wanted to have in place these what they called auxiliary units or shadow paramilitary groups throughout the whole continent that also had access to arms caches. And so, in the event of an invasion and an occupation, these groups would become activated and then start a armed rebellion against would-be Soviet occupiers.
Also, though, it was not just an event of an invasion, but I know in Italy, an event of an electoral victory by a communist party. And
Yes, yeah. There was I believe it was 48 or 49. It was very likely that the Communist Party was going to win, and there was a bunch of CIA meddling that went on, and to ensure that that outcome did not happen. Um, and so, yeah, that was part of it. And these groups were referred to as stay behind networks of, secret operatives and organizations, and they were, militant groups uh, dispersed throughout the continent. So that was the outward justification for the operation. And these resistance forces, as they characterized them, were to carry out guerrilla warfare and sabotage. I mean, after this all came out in the 80s, the U.S. State Department tried to say, "Oh no, none of them were terrorist organizations," but it's abundantly clear that they were. I mean, Gladio actually was the name of the Italian branch, and I think the Belgian branch as well. But then which means sword, and that became like a catch-all term for this whole anti-communist clandestine network of factions. And eventually, they started carrying out covert, uh, instead of just being on the basis of operating on the premise of this invasion. Of course, that invasion never happened, because the Soviets never had any intention of invading, obviously. So what they started doing was, in order to expand, state security power, um, and NATO's budget and all that, they basically started uh, green lighting or facilitating these terrorist groups to carry out terrorist attacks against European citizens. And these attacks, many of them were subsequently blamed on left-wing groups, like namely Baader Meinhof, the Red Brigades in Italy was another one. Um, it's also debated even in Ireland they were operating, and many of the paramilitary groups like the Ulster Loyalists, were said to have carried out attacks that were blamed on the IRA. I mean, the IRA did do their own bombings, of course, but and it's debated, but it's clear that they were operating there as well. So these were false flags that were done, for the purpose of political destabilization or to foment what they called a strategy of tension, so that the citizenry in Europe would be so frightened that they would cling to the state and, basically hand over more political power to state security apparatus and greater surveillance and all that. And also they would become very fearful of the left, even though it was, these fascist and right-wing groups that were actually carrying out these terrorist attacks. And also there was a lot of involvement with organized crime and the mafia in Gladio throughout Europe. So, there was a real effort to discredit the left and the various communist and socialist parties in Europe, like Italy, and you were mentioning, that still had significance after the war. And so there was also a psychological warfare component. And this went on for decades. And it only became known, Gladio only became known in the 1980s when I think one of the attacks they tried to carry out in Italy went wrong and was exposed in the local media. And eventually, I think it was just the Washington Post and maybe a couple Western newspapers did a story stateside and acknowledged that this went on. But there was, as far as Europe goes, there was only a few formal inquiries in a few of the countries. Most of them did not really do serious internal investigations. I mean, it's kind of, like that. What's that famous newspaper headline from the 90s? About the CIA finds no link between itself and the crack trade. It's like obviously they're not going to hold themselves accountable, which is why most there's a terrific documentary which we'll post a link to in the comments by BBC, of all places. But that's sort of why all these agents that are interviewed in the documentary are just openly confessing to having done this stuff, with no, threat or fear of reprisal. So, and yeah, it's a terrifying thing that happened during the Cold War, and it's something that you can see historical parallels with later on, and which is why I think there's a lot of public distrust surrounding things like the war on terror and all these attacks that have happened since, because it's we know for a fact that Western governments were doing this to justify their policies and they're just the way that they they worked with these openly fascist groups and pin these attacks on communists and socialists, and it's a perfect example to show people about how the West has supported actual terrorism, while authentic movements for things like national liberation are labeled as terror. It's the IRA that are called terrorists, not these right-wing loyalist groups that they were working with. Actually, there's a great book that people could read. It's called NATO Secret Armies by Daniel Ganser, which is very good. But
I think too, Operation Gladio combined with a lot of Nazi officials getting incorporated into NATO, and then you add Operation Paperclip, it all becomes very clear that fascism never really was defeated as such, just sort of reincorporated into the Western Empire. And so another thing is the JFK files that were recently released proves something that the tankies had suspected for quite some time, that namely the US government had an, well, somewhat indirect hand in the Hungarian Revolution. The Soviet invasion of Hungary in 1956 was one of the first time that the term freedom fighters was used in the Western press, which, gets a lot of use to this day.
mm-hmm.
Now it is conclusive that the CIA had a hand in this, which, it makes sense. One of the CIA documents, I think released in like 2014, reads, quote, While our chronological summary does not pretend to show that we predicted the precise time and place of the outbreak of violence in Budapest, it does show that we were aware of and reported on the potential explosiveness of the situation in Hungary and elsewhere in the satellites. We are on record as pointing out more than once that the Soviets were faced with a choice in Hungary between losing effective control over their satellite or adopting repressive military measures. In effect, both these eventualities came to pass. And I have more documents from the CIA on this, which I can put in the links.
Yeah, I don't know if I've actually looked at that one. That sounds interesting, but yeah, I mean I've seen a lot of people. I tried to like look at the counter arguments that people were making about this. Like, oh, it doesn't show that the CIA were backing them. It just, all it says is that they were supporting this nonprofit charity that the commander of in that rebellion started when he was given haven in the United States. So it's like, well, it's showing that the commander, you know, of the insurrection was a CIA asset. And first of all, anyone who knows anything about um, the CIA sponsoring of armed groups is that it's 9 times out of 10 it's done through legitimate philanthropic NGOs and stuff like that.
I once saw someone, they were online, someone was trying to say that, see, NGOs are trustworthy because an NGO means a non-governmental organization. It's like, for one thing, it can be a for-profit thing, so that makes it trustworthy. And for another thing, they're oftentimes government connected. So
Yeah, I mean it's really a misnomer. I mean, and an oxymoron. I mean when they call themselves non-governmental organizations, because yeah, like most of them are getting their money from U.S. government, and actually that's only something that's increased in recent years because, like we were talking about last episode, the Church Committee and Rockefeller Commission exposed how the CIA was doing all these coups and overthrowing democratic leaders around the world. And so after that, they actually really increased the use of, nonprofits and NGOs like National Endowment for Democracy and the Soros Foundation and all these other places that, go into these countries and set up um, nonprofits and all that and start organizing, civil society organizations, starting protest groups and political movements opposing whatever, state happens to be in power that they're against. So yeah, like there have been people who've been saying, oh no, they just supported this nonprofit charity that, and it's like, well, yeah, that was because their revolt failed and now they're having to try and do it through this other way. But it's interesting because the whole Hungary discussion has been like one of the most hotly debated topics in left-wing politics going back half century. I mean, the response to the intervention in Hungary in 56, that, splintered what was already a fiercely divided left. And, many people up to that point who had stood with the Soviet Union against all the propaganda and McCarthyism and all that, even they ended up jumping ship because it happened the exact same year as another thing we discussed last episode, the speech that Khrushchev gave, um, which is funny because he was the one that ordered the intervention in Hungary, Khrushchev. But the way that it was portrayed as this authentic uprising, um, you know, and even the people on the left that tried to defend it, they and there were communists that were involved in it. Don't get me wrong, but it's just like any other rebellion that happens in a country that the U.S. Wants to conduct regime change in. And there might be legitimate grievances among people living there, um, and then those grievances are seized upon, and then the movement is transformed into something that becomes pro-Western. And, all you have to do to know the political character of the uprising in Hungary is that, well, yes, there were some communists involved. If you look at just the photographs, the footage of the protests in Budapest and other places, most of the protesters are waving the flag of the Kingdom of Hungary, which, during the Second World War, it was a fascist kingdom, number one, and conducted massive anti-Semitic pogroms, and so inevitably there was remnants from the Arrow Cross movement and the Horthy regime in the counter-revolutionary factions. And yes, there were communists involved, but it was whatever legitimate grievances the people had were being channeled into a movement that again, like as soon as they got in power briefly in 56, the first thing they did was they withdrew from the Warsaw Pact. I mean, so that's what it was all about. It was about it was a pro-Western, really kind of like one of the first, what they now call color revolutions.
Well, that strategy of, you have a country that you don't like and you set up something right nearby it to incite it to invade, to make it look bad or to start a war has been repeated so many times. I mean, it's still happening today, which leads to another topic, which is the Soviet-Afghan War. And that one, I mean, has some historical parallels today, to the Ukraine War. So
Mhm.
on December 25th, 1979, the Soviet Union invaded the non-aligned nation of Afghanistan. The Soviet-Afghan War, triggered by this invasion, lasted for nearly a decade, and it was notoriously a grisly conflict. I even reading about it, read a book about it once, and it was, the Soviet soldiers were shocked at how the Mujahideen rebel fighters were so well equipped, and that's where the parallels come in. So it is documented that the U.S. funded the guerrilla militia known as the Mujahideen, and the funding for them laid the groundwork for Al Qaeda and the Taliban, actually. But so the amount of funding was pretty high too. The US government provided them with $60 million each year from 1980 to 1985, $470 million in 1986, $630 million per year in 1987 and 1989. So I mean that explains how they were well armed and well equipped. But the narrative used to, get people in the US to be okay with this large amount of money was that they were defending the Afghans people's sovereignty against the evil empire. But the thing is that the US government began funding the Mujahideen 6 months before the Soviet invasion. The former National Security Advisor, I have no idea how to say this name.
Zbigniew Brzezinski, I think is how it's.
Okay, thank you. Even admitted that, quote, that secret operation was an excellent idea. It had the effect of drawing the Russians into the Afghan trap. We now had the opportunity of giving the USSR its Vietnam War. So, as we can see, there are parallels with the Ukraine War and inciting an invasion.
Yeah, and which is why, I don't want to split hairs or argue semantics. And I even find myself, you know, saying that myself because it's so ubiquitous. And, like you're saying now about what Russia's doing in Ukraine, um, gets characterized similarly, except now it's, they say an unprovoked invasion is they've added that. But I would actually, just say that I would actually challenge the notion based on the facts that you just laid out about that very Machiavellian interview that Brzezinski gave to, I think it was Le Nouvel Observateur, or however you say it. Because, you know, the intervention that they launched, you know, first of all, in Afghanistan, they had a revolution there. There was yes, the government there had problems, but it was a, you know, relatively progressive socialist government that was like educating women and, you know, doing land reform and stuff like that. And it was, you know, viewed as uh, you know, this was intolerable to the Islamists that Brzezinski and the CIA started arming in Operation Cyclone in 79. And they, you know, were doing things, you know, not just committing terrorist attacks, but, you know, throwing acid in women's faces, you know, for not veiling and stuff like that. And they wanted to ban, you know, women from schools. And so there was a deliberate attempt to use radical Islamists who adhered to a very intolerant strain of Islam for U.S. foreign policy goals. And you know, even as you were saying, the nucleus of what later became the Taliban and the Northern Alliance also, and then Al Qaeda, that all coalesced out of out of the Mujahideen. And, you know, the U.S. has tried to claim in hindsight, you know, that they only armed the Afghan Mujahideen. But, you know, it's obvious to anyone with a room temperature IQ that the money that they sent and the training spilled over into the foreign fighters, because that's what ended up happening, is that the other countries in the region, you know, who like Saudi Arabia and Pakistan and all them, they imported, you know, foreign Arab, mostly Arab volunteers into that theater, and they joined their ranks. And you know, they were conducting a whole, what they considered a holy war against, you know, invading infidels. And bin Laden, you know, you know, the CIA tries to claim, oh, well, we didn't directly train him because the money was funneled through Pakistan. And then, but, you know, it's known that his first trainer was like a U.S. Special Forces commando. He worked with generals in the Pakistani army that the U.S. was supporting. The money and weapons they sent inevitably ended up falling into the hands of what later became of his precursor to Al Qaeda. But you know, it was a strategic asset, and you know, it was Al Qaeda later became, you know, a transnational terrorist entity. But their founders were armed and trained by the CIA to help the Mujahideen defeat the Soviets and the government that they were backing in Afghanistan. So that's just why I would, the fact the what you listed there at the end about Brzezinski admitting that they were funding them before the Soviets intervened, which was, you know, something that was done at the government there, the legitimate government requested help. So it's similar, like, you know, with what happened in Syria when Russia intervened there, or in even in Ukraine. I mean, because they're the separatists in eastern Ukraine, they appealed for help to Russia, and you know, their sovereignty was not being respected. They were not allowed to secede from Ukraine. So I mean, it doesn't really matter. I mean, it's splitting hairs, but it is a talking point that they like to, you know, ram, you know, that it was an invasion because it's.
Oh yeah, no, I say invasion, and then because then I was trying to present the evidence that sort of shows that these quote invasions always have some precursor to them, with usually
Exactly.
the CIA setting it up. It's like setting a trap, come,
Exactly.
have an invasion. And then we can, oh, look, they invaded this little helpless country yet we were like amassing troops on the border or something.
Yeah. Yeah, it's absolutely the case.
I think too, it's especially ironic, the mainstream media loves to scream about how backwards and extremist the Middle East is when you know, the US has been systematically encouraging and making sure they are never having any sort of progressive movement there.
Yeah, I mean they've been look at the regime. I mean, it's like when they go on and on about Assad being a dictator or whatever. I mean, look at who the US is supporting. They're supporting the most medieval regimes, Saudi Arabia, which, still is like crucifying people for like the crime of sorcery and just insane just and that's what these groups in these Islamist groups that the U.S. backed in Syria, that's what they want to form as an Islamic State with a strict interpretation of Sharia law. The minorities we're already seeing being persecuted there, like Christians and Alawites. That's what their political project is, and it's been going on for decades. I mean, the U.S. also I mean, not only are they been aligned with Saudi Arabia, which is the fountainhead of all this terrorism, but they've also supported even like they're not even more moderate, but like the Muslim Brotherhood for decades, the West supported that because that's another um, you know, fundamentalist Sunni organization that has influence throughout the region that their tactics are a little bit different than Al Qaeda because they do political activism and I mean, yeah, they do violence and terrorist attacks too, but they do have like some practicality to them and like run for political office and things like that. But their end goal is the same. And so that, yeah, it's been a concerted effort for decades to keep the Middle East backwards and to also to prevent any kind of unifying um, force with the Palestinian resistance, and it's all been for the benefit of Israel and keeping the occupation going. Um, but yeah, I mean, and terrorism has been something that's been supported by the West for decades, and it's to the point where it's like people always make the argument about blowback, like, oh well, it was a miscalculation. We supported the Mujahideen in Afghanistan. We didn't know bin Laden was going to go on to become a terrorist. It's like, well, even after bin Laden's group, ostensibly declared a holy war against the U.S., and was bombing the embassies in Africa and the USS Cole, and then did not ostensibly, I mean, presumably did 9/11. There's a lot of questions around that too, though. But even while that was going on, the U.S. was still supporting Mujahideen elsewhere, namely the Balkans, Bosnia. Bin Laden had people there. And then also in Kosovo, they delisted a terrorist organization with known ties to Al Qaeda, the Kosovo Liberation Army. They also had connections to organized crime. Uh, and they delisted them. They removed them as a terrorist organization and started openly supporting them against Serbia. And then they formed this little protectorate, Kosovo. And now the first president of Kosovo and the former head of the KLA is now on trial for war crimes and for like has been linked to human organ trafficking and all this stuff. And I mean, just the what I'm trying to say is the whole use of radical Islamists as a strategic asset never really interrupted, even after you know the war on terror was going on and the U.S. was pursuing bin Laden ostensibly. I mean, it's always been weird to me that like CNN could find him for an interview, but like they could never locate him. Um, I mean, it was just ridiculous. And then also the other place, which I have a couple upcoming articles about, is that they were also supporting these people in Chechnya as well. Um, which is another place where uh, radical Islamists were uh, supported to basically try and balkanize Russia and prevent it from ever returning to the world stage as well. So that's another place. Um,
I think, I mean, it's especially important that the US keeps the Middle East sort of floundering because, if there was a progressive movements there, they wouldn't want to just sell all the oil to the US companies. And so, um, about Syria, just a recap. On December 8th of 2024, the Syrian president Bashar al-Assad fell. The government collapsed during a major offensive spearheaded by Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, which was formerly designated by the US as a terrorist organization, but everyone seemed to forget that. The new self-appointed Syrian president is Abu Muhammad al-Julani. That's just one of his names. He's gone by multiple different names, I think. He was a member of Al.
Al-Shara now, I think, is his name this week.
Okay. Well, he was a member of Al Qaeda, and you know, there was on wanted posters, but now he is the poster child of a free Syria, which everyone was celebrating. Syria's so free now. You can see him on CNN giving interviews in almost the same clothes that Zelensky usually wears. And the HTS have been called freedom fighters, which, we already know what freedom fighters means.
I mean, it's interesting because he's still required, like when the German foreign minister, their delegation went to Syria for a state visit, he wouldn't shake, what's her name? Annalena Baerbock, I think that's her name. He wouldn't shake her hand. It was extremely awkward. And then actually, I don't know about all of them. He might be doing them now, but the CNN interviews he's done, I think he's insisted um, that the female anchors wear a hijab. Um, and of course, um, when an Iranian foreign minister, I think it was, insisted upon the same thing, what's her name, Christiane Amanpour, she like walked out in protest, like I'm not going to wear it for you. So, but when it's a Muslim leader that is friendly to the U.S., they'll oblige, which I think is kind of telling. Um,
As
but
to
go ahead.
as to Zelensky, um, I guess it was published a few years ago, but there's a book called Unlocking Your Inner Zelensky. And the author goes so far as to say that Zelensky is a great spiritual leader of our age, which is just cracking me up because he's literally like, he's obviously such a US puppet. And it was, I mean, people are like crying and freaking out when Trump and Vance chewed him out at the White House. But he's kind of beholden to them, and they were basically like, "You're getting too cocky and step back in line." People are, it's Zelensky standing up or something, but and that's, I mean, I'm sure we'll see that in Syria as these sort of terroristic groups or what or people are used, and then when they're not convenient to the U.S. empire anymore, they're just tossed aside. And I'm
Yeah,
sure
he's definitely going to get that treatment. I think his days are numbered. Um, he his use value will eventually run out, and he'll get the same treatment that Noriega and Saddam Hussein and all these other people who at one time were aligned with the United States and then on a dime just get thrown under the bus. And yeah, I mean, it's absurd when people are painting him as some kind of uh, heroic statesman. I mean, the last Ukrainian presidential election. I mean, first of all, he ran, he actually was elected because he ran as the peace candidate. It was Poroshenko that was made out to be, I mean, and was the fanatically pro-Western candidate. Uh, and Zelensky, did a very good job playing both sides. I mean, he was a political outsider. He's a comedian. He's not really a politician. How he made his money is very mysterious. Poroshenko is actually got all his money from the confectionery industry. He's a chocolatier, and he's known as the Chocolate King. And so during their last presidential election, which which is something that Zelensky, the Democratic leader, has suspended indefinitely. The last election, they held their debates in a soccer stadium, and I think because Zelensky had accused Poroshenko of being an alcoholic, they like threw back and forth accusations, and they held the debate in the stadium and got drug tested beforehand to prove their sobriety. I mean, just the total political circus. The idea, I mean, Ukraine is consistently ranked, within corruption rankings near the top in Europe. I mean, it's just there. It's been totally, um, prostitution and crime, and it's just rife with corruption.
Well,
And nationalism as well. And that's I'm assuming you're going to want to bring up the Azov battalion because that's another
yes.
rebranded terrorist organization.
Yeah. No, I just been thinking about, all these people still with their Ukrainian flags saying they're standing with Ukraine, but the whole prolongation of the Ukraine war has, because of the US funding, has been why so many Ukrainian people have died, and where they're having to literally grab people on the streets to force them to go fight. Because for one thing, Ukraine historically was, sort of connected and a part of Russia. I mean, it's been back and forth, and there was a lot of Nazi sympathizers in Ukraine, which that's a whole nother topic. But if there hadn't been, this building up of troops on the border, and then the constant US funding, the war would have ended a long time ago, and all those people's lives would have been spared. So the same people saying they care about Ukraine, it's just,
Yeah, they don't care. I mean, a whole generation of young men has been wiped out totally needlessly. It's actually very sad. I mean, and yeah, historically, Eastern Ukraine, um, most of the people there, are Russian speaking, and culturally and everything identify as Russian. It's the western part, and not even all the western part. Galicia, which was under, it used to be under the Polish and then the Austro-Hungarians, um, and it's that part that's uh, sees itself as European and not connected to the Asiatic Russian hordes, and those are the people that when the Nazis invaded sided with the Germans and participated in the Holocaust and all that. And yeah, it's very similar to the rebranding of jihadi groups. It's the same thing with the rebranding of far right fascist groups, because in the 80s, well, and actually even before that, in the 50s, the U.S. supported. After the Second World War ended, there was Ukrainian nationalists launched an insurgency against the Soviet Union, Soviet Ukraine, and the CIA supported that. And then, but it was put down. And so Ukrainian nationalism was kind of like in a period of dormancy or, but it was kept in hibernation enough to where, to when in the 80s, Gorbachev, started uh, his reform policies, which, permitted uh, nationalism to come out of the woodwork. And that's when you saw a resurgence of Ukrainian nationalism, which is its development was really intrinsically linked with European fascism. And the Ukrainian nationalists, a lot of them were given safe harbor in places like Canada and here in the United States. And of course, Canada last year, they even had one of them in their parliament and gave them a round of applause. But
I
so that
forgot
was
about
all,
that.
yeah, it's insane, surreal. Um, and so, yeah, in the 80s, that all came back. And then once Ukraine got its independence, um, those political forces just gained greater and greater prominence. And eventually, it just came to a head, to the point where they, were removing Russian as an co-official language. So, half the country is suddenly not allowed to learn in school in their native language. And, they're erecting monuments and naming streets after people that participated in Second World War, in the Holocaust, and then tearing down World War II memorials. I mean, so of course, if you're Russian, ethnically Russian, and you live there, who would want to live under that? People, they're honoring the people that killed your grandparents or your relatives. I mean, especially given the amount of people that died in the Second World War in the Soviet Union, it was over 20 something million. So, yeah, eventually it just came to a head as the West continued to instigate this stuff. And so that's why you have the war that you have now. And that has involved, the rebranding of these militant neo-Nazi groups like the Azov Battalion and Right Sector and all the rest of them. And now to the point where Ukraine has incorporated Azov into its armed forces. I mean, it's like imagine if the US military had like, I don't know, the KKK like incorporated into its. I mean, it's not quite the same comparison, but you know what I mean. It's just insane this
No,
rebrand.
no, but Russia's fascist.
Yeah, that's another crazy misconception. Because actually, I mean, if you follow Russian politics, I mean, they actually, I mean, in the West, you see always these articles about how Putin is the leader of this far right resurgence happening now, and they're always usually referring to, these like Eurosceptic, right wing populists and Europe. And but anyone who knows anything about Russian politics, first of all, the far right in Russia hates Putin. They're a real far right, um, fascist, like groups that like want the Russian Empire back and want like, Russia to be this revanchist, country to go out and like, I don't know, retake Alaska and conquer all the territories that the czars had. And those people are all banned. Like that's who's been banned in Russia. That's who Putin has cracked down on. There are some of them that are tolerated, like this guy Zhirinovsky. His party is allowed to run every year in the elections. He gets very little support. Um, the main opposition is the Communist Party. Um, and Meanwhile, in Ukraine, it's the opposite. The Communist Party is banned, and the neo-Nazi organizations are openly serving in the military. So, yeah, it's another misconception. I mean, yes, Putin is a conservative. There's been a revival of the Orthodox Church and all that, but like it's really trivializing the term far right or fascist to call him a fascist. I mean, corrupt, yes. Is there, you know, A lot of inequality in Russia, yes. But does he have his own oligarchs? Yes. But the reason he's disliked is because he kicked out all the American financial advisors, the American-backed oligarchs. He renationalized the oil and gas. Um, he's not politically ideal, but like when people are calling him like a fascist and all this stuff, I'm like, you know nothing about
Well,
Russian politics.
I think it's kind of convenient to have the term fascist sort of lose its meaning, because then when something that's actually fascist happens, the term has lost all meaning completely at that point. So you can't call fascism fascism.
Yeah, yeah, and actually, the thing is while yeah, like a lot of these right-wing populist parties in Europe that they're trying to say like Russia is supporting, the actual, you know, unifying characteristic of all of them is that they're extremely Islamophobic and very pro-Israel. And that's not something that, I mean, first of all, Russia has like over 20 million Muslims. It's like political suicide for anybody to be, um, for any politician to be Islamophobic. And in fact, the one person who tried to run on that platform is the one that the U.S. supported, Alexei Navalny, who's now dead. But he actually was one of the people who coined the phrase "stop feeding the Caucasus." He wanted to, like the far right, wanted to kick the Caucasus out of Russia because it's Muslim dominated. And they've had a huge terrorism problem there for many years, though it's under control now. Um, and Yeah, Navalny never had more than 5% support because it's not something, and he then rebranded himself as like this liberal, pro-democratic, but he's basically like he's a nationalist. And the thread that runs through all these right-wing populist groups in Europe is pro-Israel Islamophobia. So if any foreign entity is stirring up this wave of right-wing populism in the EU, it's Israel, it's not Russia. So the only reason that they happen to uh, maybe support Russia, like at least outwardly, is the fact that they are that it's conservative and that they're isolationists and they don't want to support the Ukraine war. They don't want to support money to Ukraine. They want to bring manufacturing jobs back or whatever. But it has nothing to do with. It's just a whole misinformation narrative that they put out there for the sake of justifying NATO expansion to say Russia's this threat that's fomenting trying to break up the EU and NATO and all that. So
I I think I saw this a few months ago, and this sort of, I think, explains a lot why the West hates Putin so much. Is I remember if he was in Germany, but he was speaking to some German official, and the official was speaking English, and he's like, "Why aren't you speaking German? That's your country, that's your heritage. Why are you speaking English?" And that's why the Western Empire doesn't like him, because he doesn't want to just be a puppet for the West and let them have their way with Russia.
yeah, I mean he I think first of all the way he came to power was very unexpected and he was an unknown and by that time Yeltsin had also fallen out of favor because Yeltsin had actually I mean first of all he'd become this huge embarrassment. The Russian economy had completely collapsed. And actually, it's a funny story. Um, uh, this is kind of off track from terrorism, but it is kind of sort of related in a roundabout way. But you always hear these stories now about like, with the Russiagate people saying that uh Putin has a tape of Trump with Russian prostitutes or whatever. There's actually a um not a kernel of truth to that, but the way that Putin supposedly, this is the story of how he ingratiated himself with Yeltsin enough to get appointed prime minister, is that at the time, this is like the late 90s, uh, Yeltsin, was notoriously corrupt, and he was finally starting to be investigated. I think there was like a special prosecutor appointed and was looking into his uh, shady dealings with and stuff. And Putin was head of the FSB at the time, which is the KGB's successor. And supposedly Putin was surveilling this prosecutor and caught the prosecutor with several prostitutes and then sent the video to Russian media. And then they put it out in the press. And so instantly, this prosecutor that was like maybe going to take down Yeltsin, um, was instantly discredited. And so I think that that really, that made Putin and Yeltsin close enough to where he was appointed to be prime minister. And then Putin also, uh, became very much involved in the Second Chechen War. And there's also people who say that, like there a lot of like people like John McCain and Marco Rubio and all these people, you'll hear them say that Putin came to power by staging these apartment bombings that happened that were committed actually by Chechen separatists. Um, but the way that he was a political unknown that came to power that the West didn't have control over, and he was a statesman that stood up for Russia's interests. And the last, first of all, he after 9/11, he tried to forge a partnership with the US, which was, very tentative and eventually fell apart because he tried to say, hey, we have this same problem, with these terrorist groups. But, the US refused to make any connection between them. And the Chechen separatists were similarly rebranded as freedom fighters. Um, and then he spoke out against the Iraq War, and then the final straw was he, started pushing back against the NATO expansion, and then he just became the devil incarnate. Um, but yeah, I think terrorism, it's an interesting um, subject, and I think one thing that we should get into is you'll hear people now in regard to like the Palestinian cause, um, you know, like Hamas are portrayed as terrorists because they're Islamists. Um, but I think that there's a distinction that should be made, and that's another aspect that we can get into is because it's even people on the left you'll hear say, oh well, Israel, they helped fund Hamas at one point, and so they're just as bad, or they've helped derail the peace process or whatever. But that's, I think, for the purpose of robbing them of their political agency and their autonomy, and regardless of their Islamist character. And it is also a lot more complicated than that, because yes, Israel um, uh, supported Hamas, the precursor to Hamas, for the purpose of undermining like the secular PLO, and then also the Marxists, the PFLP. Um, but as soon as like the Intifada happened and it became weapons were involved, Israel stopped doing that. I think that it backfired on them, and it's just to delegitimize that characterization, is to just their political character doesn't matter. I mean, and it's to deflect from the state terrorism and if it was Hamas that's preventing the peace process, why are they expanding the settlements in the West Bank, which are not even under control of
or or killing all the Hamas's negotiators. They made sure to do that too. And now, they're saying, well, we have to start bombing again because, Hamas wouldn't release the hostages when Hamas didn't release all the hostages because Israel broke the ceasefire again, unsurprisingly, like basically like 3 days after the ceasefire or something. I don't remember exactly, but it was very soon. And I mean, what's more terroristic than Israel's pager attack?
Yeah.
That mostly killed and harmed young people and medical personnel.
And look at the difference. I mean, look at the way that the um, captives, the hostages were treated. I mean, you want to know, you want to hear about what real terrorists do to hostages? Okay, so I was talking about the Chechens earlier, right? The worst terrorist attack, or one of the worst, I mean, it is the worst, that the Chechen separatists committed was in September 2004. I mean, in Russia, they referred to it as the Russian 9/11. They took in North Ossetia, which is in southern Russia, they took the separatists, they took a school full of over 1,100 people, including almost 800 kids, and took them all and put them inside a gymnasium. And first of all, it was an extremely hot day, so it's a sweltering gymnasium. They made them all take off most of their clothes, so they're half naked into this sweltering gymnasium. And inside a basketball court, they surrounded them with tripwire explosives and bombs hanging off the basketball hoop. 1,100 people. They couldn't go to the bathroom. They couldn't eat. So in order to survive, they were drinking their own urine and then having to go to the bathroom on the floor. So the place is smelling fucking awful. And this is 3 days. And they held them there for 3 days, and then eventually the place was raided and by the special forces, and over almost 400 people died in the firefight, and I think almost 200 of them were kids. And but that's how, you know, actual terrorists treat hostages. They don't walk out smiling, with
I think
yeah. I mean, it's just like there's just no comparison. I mean, when you see
I
the way
think
these
uh,
Israeli hostages were treated.
sorry, I was gonna say I think one of the Israeli hostages like actually wrote a thank you letter to Hamas. I remember seeing that. I think I have it somewhere. Because I think he was older and diabetic, and they made sure to give him his diabetes treatments regularly.
Yeah,
Whereas you
yeah.
see the Palestinian hostages are like starved and have crazy sores and welts and bruises and
Subject to torture. Yeah, I mean and we're talking about the rebranding of terrorists. I mean, in the school where that happened, it was in Beslan, North Ossetia. And, right after that attack occurred, the European Court of Human Rights, they condemned Russia for their response, which it was seen as a very touch and go decision or reckless decision to storm the buildings because they had hostages in them. They actually got the same sort of flack there was an earlier terrorist incident where Chechens, they held about 800 people inside of a movie theater or an auditorium, a theater, a musical theater, I should say. And the Russians were criticized because they released a bunch of fentanyl-based gas to try and knock everybody in the place out. And unfortunately, what ended up happening was it killed most of the people. And then there was a big firefight. I mean, it was horrible. Um, and the reason that they didn't negotiate with them is because there had been an earlier incident where they took almost 2,500 people hostage in a hospital, and they gave in to their demands. They gave them everything. They withdrew from Chechnya. And what did they do? They proceeded to invade Dagestan. So there was no negotiating with them. There was nothing they could do. But so after Beslan happened, and the Russians, conducted this raid, which, yes, did result. I mean, they also saved a lot of people. But the European Court of Human Rights condemned their response, and then on top of that, they passed this resolution saying that the Soviet Union had committed genocide in World War II, when it expelled all the Chechens who had collaborated with the Nazis. And, there was, again, if people want to criticize the Russian authorities for their response to, the theater in Moscow or the school in Beslan, that's one thing. But there was obvious sympathy. Where was the condemnation for the West supporting these terrorist groups to begin with? It's just the hypocrisy and calling them rebels. I mean, it's just unbelievable. So the West has a long and storied history of supporting the most barbaric um, terrorist attacks. And yeah, I have two forthcoming articles about the CIA support for the Chechens. And it's they did this in Libya, in the Balkans, in Syria, which we're now seeing the consequences of. And yet they turn around, and who do they call terrorists? They call Hamas terrorists. They call Iran a country that sponsors terrorism, not Saudi Arabia. It's just outrageous.
Well, too, now the Houthis, Trump's using as an excuse, calling them terrorists now to bomb Yemen, because what they were doing to, in solidarity with the Palestinians, was stopping a lot of the shipping lines for Israel. But no, I think this book, Liberalism, Domenico Lacerda, really illustrates how the liberalism and fascism and this connection is this colonialism and this racism. And liberalism actually has this history of genocide. And so we can sort of see how that comes to be. And, you know, there's a difference between a people fighting for self-determination and one that's just about religious fundamentalism or ethnic and racial purity. It's a gross assumption to assume that too, that because the resistance movement is religious, that it is also fundamentalist and terroristic. That it's not necessarily the case. The fight for national liberation and the one that hammers at the chains of imperialism and colonialism can come in many different forms depending on what the history of the people fighting for independence is like. The movements may be religious or nationalistic, so the West, will view them as backwards. But if the common thread that unites them is anti-imperialism, natural liberation, and self-determination, how backwards can they be versus, the actual very backwards movements that the US loves to fund?
Excellent.
One more thing. As the assassinated former Hezbollah leader Nasrallah said, quote, resistance is not terrorism. It is a legitimate response to occupation and injustice. Close quote.
Yeah, that's a really excellent points that you just made, because when these sort of things happen, or these sort of conflicts arise, very frequently the left, especially in the United States, seems to always get them wrong. And the example that I always point to is the way that the Bolsheviks were supportive of the Irish, and was that were the Republican, I mean, was that movement, purely a communist in its character? No, obviously, and it was a national movement for national liberation. But they well understood that it was objectively a progressive movement. And, Marx and Engels themselves, they came around about about the Irish question as well. And this is I think that that's a good example. And the Palestinian struggle is the same thing. It's this tendency to to get into to complicate the question of whether we should support the Palestinian resistance. That's just something that the left so often in this country and the West generally gets wrong. And I think that you hit the nail on the head there at the end. Um, and you know, there's a big distinction to be made between what the Houthis and what Hamas and are doing versus these groups that the United States rebrands for and the West rebrands for its own political interests to divide the Middle East and set it on fire, basically, is what's happened.
Yeah, I think it's telling that Ireland has been one of the few Western countries to actually come out in support of Palestine. But yeah, I mean, people too fail to realize that, like with the Marxist movement in Palestine, like all the other more progressive movements have been systematically crushed and destroyed. Like, what else do the Palestinian people have?
Yeah, that's also a very important point because if you look at the origins of Hamas, I mean, well, actually, the the Marxists in Palestine, the PFLP, my understanding, I could be wrong about this, but my understanding was that they really came to the fore because I think after the Six-Day War, Egypt was defeated, and then they came to prominence, and then later in the 80s, it was when Israel invaded Lebanon uh, and committed massive atrocities. And the Palestinians had the PLO had to flee to Lebanon and then Tunisia, I think. And so, there's all these people left trapped in Gaza. Who do they turn to? I mean, the PLO is weakened and isolated. And so, yeah, Hamas and then uh, Palestinian Islamic Jihad came along, and that's when the Intifada began. So to condemn, Hamas, like this idea we need to condemn Hamas is just bullshit. I mean, it's delegitimizing, and most Palestinians, even in Gaza, historically didn't support Hamas. What they support is the armed wing, regardless of whatever its political character is, that's resisting the occupation. Um, so yeah, that's another very important point of how Israel is just crushed, you know, and it's not up to us as Western leftists to like project our, political ideals onto what these people's, political leadership, the political character of their leadership should be. We should be supporting the resistance, um, regardless of that, I think.
Yeah, and I know even the Greek Orthodox Archbishop in Palestine basically said like the Palestinians should not and will not surrender. It's not just this, oh, it's only the extreme Islamists that want Israel to stop. And like, but the propaganda is just so intense. And then there's another thing too, is that then like we see with Syria, some people on the left will just support any what they see as sort of any liberation movement, whether or not it's actually legitimate, and sort of, you know, going like, if people are oppressed, doesn't matter who or what they are, that, and, you know, they're marginalized, they must be somehow progressive. I'm
No, yeah, that's
confused on that
100%.
topic.
That is 100% accurate. I mean, it's just like it doesn't matter what it is. If it's an armed resistance group, they don't care about what the political character is. I mean, I remember when the Syrian thing first started early on, and I got into arguments with people about this because, like, I remember there was an incident where some Syrian militants, I can't remember which group they were part of, um, there was like an incident where one of them like ripped out the heart of a Syrian soldier and ate it. I mean, it was like cannibalism. I mean, just disturbing shit.
It's like the Indiana Jones with the Temple of Doom and the cult guy, and he's like rips out people's hearts, the sacrifice.
It was, I mean, this is disturbing. I mean, this is how, like, the level of barbarism of some of these groups. And, you know, a lot of these Western socialist parties like ISO, which is now defunct, thank God, but, you know, a lot of them were all behind these Syrian rebels. And, you know, they would even accuse you of being Islamophobic and like, oh, you sound like, you know, the Bush administration talking about Islamic terrorist groups. I'm like, well, wait a minute here. Bush and them are saying that we should support these people. And don't you know about Operation Cyclone? Don't you know about how bin Laden and all them were part of, you know, just total historical ignorance. And they have this almost like infantilized understanding of like world affairs, you know, where it's just good guys versus bad guys. And, um, you know, and the fact that the number one victims of these terrorist groups are other sects of Islam, you know, Shias, Alawites, and, you know, and also Christians as well, as we're seeing now in Syria. And they don't want to hear it. They just say Assad's a dictator, and, you know, that's it. And it's just the Western left gets this stuff wrong time and time again. They got it wrong in Libya too. Um, and it's just it's very frustrating, but it's important to, I think this has been a good discussion about how the West has supported actual terrorism, and then at the same time simultaneously painted you know, authentic national liberation movements um, as as terrorist groups. I mean, it's just a total inversion of reality. Um, and you know, even in the case of like uh, you know, we're talking about Israel as an apartheid state. You know, even I think, as you mentioned when you proposed this subject as a topic for our second episode, you mentioned how um, Nelson Mandela was, you know, considered a terrorist. I think up until like the mid 2000s, to the point where I think when he came and visited the United States, like the State Department had to like issue a waiver because, I mean, they claimed it was because because of some like clerical or bureaucratic error or some BS excuse. But yeah, like you know, he had been part of an armed resistance movement and was imprisoned, and the US up until then considered him a terrorist. Even though, yeah, he'd gotten out of prison and, you know, was recognized as the legitimate new leaders. Um, yeah, that's who, you know, the U.S. is. Nelson Mandela is a terrorist, but the Mujahideen are freedom fighters. You know, that sums it up right there. Um,
I think another book that, you know, sort of loosely related is The Wretched of the Earth by Frantz Fanon, is very good for
yeah, I've got that
understanding.
here as well. Yeah, this is fantastic. Algerian, Frantz Fanon. who very much, like I was saying last time, very much influenced the Panthers. If you look at their influence, it wasn't really, like I said, Angela Davis was influenced by um, Marcuse and studied under him, but that's who, the Black Panthers were really kind of considered the the worldwide anti-colonial movement arriving home, which was why it was very, very frightening uh, to the status quo to see a black liberation group, doing, uh, what Lenin called dual power, like those community, and it's similar to what Hamas does, providing uh, services, and they aren't just an armed militant group that does suicide bombings or whatever. They also, in Gaza provide that, they always call it the Hamas run health ministry. No, they provide health services. It's a, they were elected. They provide, what any other local government does.
To don my conspiracy theory tinfoil hat, he was not very, Frantz Fanon was not very old when he died, and I think he'd had cancer and he was going to the Soviet Union for cancer treatment, but they told him they were like, we don't have the advanced technology to fully treat you. We think you need to go to the US to get better doctors. So he goes to the US, and apparently he was like watched by the CIA guy the whole time. And then he just so happens to die. So it's like, I'm just going down all sorts of
No,
rabbit
I
holes
think
with
I
that.
think that you might be onto something. I had actually just learned that about Frantz Fanon because I had wondered what his thoughts were about the USSR, and I know that like a lot of the national liberation movements, like Algeria, they had uh, sort of a, I don't want to say uneasy relationship, but like they were painted as like a proxy of the Soviet Union rather than like an authentic, uh, independent, autonomous movement. So I was kind of looking up what things he had to say about the Soviet USSR, whether he like tried to distance himself from them or whatnot. And apparently, yeah, when he got his cancer treatment, even he went there for that. But I wasn't aware of the circumstances surrounding his death, but it reminds me of what people say about Paul Robeson. I mean, Paul Robeson uh, developed very curious mental and physical health problems that a lot of people, particularly his son, believe were the result of like some kind of MK Ultra experiments. And we know that he was being heavily politically persecuted and surveilled. His passport was revoked and he couldn't I mean, he was an enemy of the state and was treated that way. So it would not surprise me at all if they had some sort of hand in Frantz Fanon's death. And cancer has also been, like that's been a weird weapon. I don't know, like the people were saying that. I remember when Hugo Chavez died, people were saying that he might have had something done to him um, by the CIA. I don't know. Actually, there was like a bunch of Latin American leaders that were like all getting cancer, and they were all leftists around the time that Chavez died. But anyway, yeah, I wouldn't put it past.
Speaking of Latin America, another thing in the JFK files was, oh, surprise, surprise. The CIA helped create famines in Cuba to then blame them on Castro. See, communism causes famines. Well, we're actually causing the famines. So just a few final things before I wrap up is, we can see that there's been a drumbeat in the media to, Taiwan. You got to be worried about Taiwan's little country, and big bad China is going to be coming for Taiwan. And that's, I worry of trying to start another proxy war with China. I hope they do not take the bait on that one. But,
Could
and
be.
so To conclude, when watching mainstream media, one must remember that terrorist usually means resistance fighters unfriendly to US imperialism, and freedom fighters means possibly terrorists and definitely foot soldiers for US interests. You must view all mainstream accounts of world events with extreme skepticism. Or maybe we're just Russian spies. You never know.
We
just
won't say.
just don't believe what the mainstream media tells you. Look for actual evidence. Thank you for listening and give us feedback. Is there anything you want to add?
No, I think this has been a great discussion. I mean, it's a rich topic. We could go on and on about it, but I think we covered most of the important ground. I would just say that as far as Taiwan goes, I do think that that's a powder keg waiting to go off. And it does seem like overall the Trump administration, while they have, you know, ostensibly there's this peace negotiation happening with Ukraine. I mean, I don't know how long that's going to last, but there does seem to be one thing about the Trump administration seems to be is that it's uh, there's a division in the ruling class, I think, between which is the greater enemy of the United States, Russia or China, and the Trump people seem to be more firmly in the China camp, and actually their whole uh, rapprochement with Russia seems to be about trying to divide the two of them. But I do foresee, um, uh, and China itself, I think, is eventually there's a window if they are going to go into Taiwan, that there's a window, that they have, and while the U.S. is really bogged down and weakened everywhere, so it could happen. I think you could be right, but no, it's been a great discussion.